start.
Thanks, everyone. This recording is mostly for internal. We're not going to put it public, but we'll share it with the people who couldn't come today, so we'll share it with them. Yeah, if you don't want to be recorded, just turn your camera off. But this session is an informal session, but we've been doing some work on sort of the wider levelling up agenda, both at Sustain and Sustainable Food Places. For those who don't know me, my name's Ren Piercy. I'm the local action coordinator for Sustainable Food Places, but based at Sustain. And I'm here with my colleagues, James, who's at Sustain, and Emily O'Brien, who's also at Sustainable Food Places, but based at Food Matters. And we basically are on a bit of a mission to support areas get food embedded into this kind of the government's sort of wider levelling up agenda. So this is a bit of a pilot, so it would be great to hear at the end of the session if it feels useful. Hopefully it will be. But we want to kind of support areas to understand kind of the language around levelling up, how food is related, and how food partnerships, whether based at the council or not, can kind of work on supporting with kind of bids that are related to food. So the session will James and I will give a bit of an overview and some case studies, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. Thank you everyone for filling in that Survey Monkey with your priorities and your knowledge of the funds and everything, and we'll have a bit of a discussion on how food priorities can link in with local council priorities and this kind of language of the levelling up themes. I do want to kind of preface with we are absolutely by no means experts, but we've just thought it'd be useful to bring everyone in the room. There might be things we talk about that you guys will know more about, so do jump in. There'll be an opportunity for everyone to introduce themselves once you go into breakout rooms, but we often find once you do that, if we all introduce ourselves now, it might take the whole session, as much as I'd love to just have a chat. So I'm just going to share my screen and share with you what we're going to run over today. That is not what we need to see. Can you see that? Can you give me a thumbs up? Yeah, great. So bit of a rough agenda. We'll kind of run through what we're going to go through today, run through the levelling up priorities and funds and some case studies. If you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat and we'll come to you after we've run through those two things, and we can bring you in and answer those questions. We'll go into some breakout groups. I've loosely, can you see my the agenda, or can you see the notes?
It all looks fine, Ren. We can just see the agenda.
And then we will go through everyone's priorities and how they can link in with the levelling up proposals, and then come back to a bit of discussion in the Q&A. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be a bit more familiar with kind of levelling up priorities, how it overlaps with other priorities, and understand a bit of the language used and how to engage with kind of MPs and the right people in the council. And hopefully we'll leave with some ideas and proposals that you might want to put forward for future funding opportunities. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to run through the funding available and the kind of wider levelling up agenda.
Thank you, Ren. Yeah, so I'll give a bit of an overview of the different funds that fit into the levelling up agenda, try and give sort of a good look into the priorities and the themes of those funds, and talk about some of the process behind those funds as well. So I'll start with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. If any of you happen to work on any of the EU structural funds that we used to have, this might look quite similar because it's sort of being touted as the replacement of those EU structural funds. And obviously the Shared Prosperity Fund is a real kind of key part of levelling up, and it's going to be the longest fund that'll be in place. The other funds are only really lasting for a few years, whereas this hopefully will kind of be there for the future to keep investing in local communities. By the financial year 2025-26, it'll be worth 2.6 billion per year across the UK. But until then, that kind of the amount of money available will be incrementally increasing. So this year it's going to be £400 million. I think the year afterwards 700, and then the year after that 1.5 billion, I think. And the Shared Prosperity Fund is going to be split between local authorities. So each local authority will get some money from it. It won't be an equal split. It's done via a formula to decide where the money goes, but each local authority will get some money to then put into projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I said, for this year, it's 400 million across UK. And the way that the money is being allocated is through this formula, which I will confess I don't know what the formula is, but it does mean each area will get some money. And it's going to be allocated to all the different types of authorities. So everything from sort of mayoral combined to lower tier unitary, and then the Greater London Authority being a slightly unique one. And there's also going to be something which again, not quite got my head around yet, but it's called the multiply. So each county council will get, or not each, but actually, yeah, I think it is each county council will get like a little top up as well. But the key thing at the moment is that local authorities are going through the process of having to create what's being called investment plans. And they are supposed to be engaging with stakeholders within their local authority areas, pulling together these investment plans, which I'll touch on in more detail in a moment, and then submitting those to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, who will have to sign off on those. So yeah, those investment plans will have to kind of tackle some of the key themes that are in the Shared Prosperity Fund. So next slide, please, Ren. So those are the sort of the three broad themes that fit into the Shared Prosperity Fund. They all kind of stand alone, but they also interlink with each other as well. And I think, I imagine that local authorities will be looking at using that money to invest in things that try and cover more than one theme. And the language that's kind of used in the Shared Prosperity Funds around these themes is things like creating pride in place, trying to stimulate local economic activity, and giving or empowering local community leaders to have agency to make decisions as well. And when I look at those three themes, I do feel like food and farming can fit into all of them. You know, I think food and farming, it's very much in rural, peri-urban areas, but also in urban areas, it's key to local economic activity in terms of providing jobs. I believe that the food system as a whole is the most dispersed across the country when it comes to where jobs are located. And it can also, you know, be very much key drivers of enterprise opportunities as well. You know, for example, like food retail, like food farmers markets and food hubs, they can be, they could play a key role in regenerating, you know, town centres and high streets, providing more jobs, as well as getting businesses to collaborate more as well. And I think it would be fair to say that a lot of people take quite a lot of pride, or at least, yeah, quite a few people take a lot of pride in sort of local food and, you know, farmers being part of that community and those sorts of things. So I would like to think that food and farming could very much deliver on all three of those themes. I mean, the people and the skills is a little bit of a difficult one because the government seems to be putting a lot of emphasis on adult numeracy, but there will be these sort of support programs, and I'll touch on it in a minute, but there will also be this National Skills Fund as well coming through this year. Next slide, please, Ren. Just a few other points to note, really, that while the fund is about trying to sort of improve the places where people live, it's also about sort of supporting individuals and businesses and improving the life chances of individuals in those communities as well. So it's also good to bear in mind that that's around kind of like, you know, things to do with health and jobs. So a really important thing to remember when trying to engage with your local authority and thinking about what proposals you might want to like to get in those investment plans. And the other thing is that the Shared Prosperity Fund can complement money that's already been gained from, say, the Levelling Up Fund or the Community Ownership Fund. So it could build on what's already been done or what's happening. So it doesn't have to be about creating something completely new. So there's those two different angles that you can come at as well. Next slide, please, Ren. Oh, was there one before? Yeah, there you go. So just quickly on the investment plan to look at some of the language that's being used and some of the things that's expected to come out of these investment plans. So local authorities are going to have to set these outcomes, and they're going to have to lay out sort of the interventions or what the money is going to be spent on to deliver on those outcomes. And, you know, I suppose an example of an outcome could be improving access to sustainably produced healthy food in the local community, for example, and then, you know, where that money is going to be spent to achieve that. And then the indicators that they're going to use to monitor the progress. And I think that's important for the Department for Levelling Up and Housing Community. And within these investment plans, while this is fitting under the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, I think that DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up, they're expecting local authorities to set out how they will use levelling up more widely, so like the Levelling Up Fund and the priorities of levelling up as a whole as an agenda within those investment plans. And that might also include where there's opportunities to get private money, for example, to help build more on those proposals. And those investment plans, they're being created at the moment, and local authorities will have to submit those by the end of August this year. So it's a very short time frame. In fact, I think it's way too short. They should have given a lot more time for this, but unfortunately that's just what's been set. So I would just say, you know, it's really critical to be engaging with your local authorities. While they should be proactively doing it themselves, they might not be. I don't know, you might have already been speaking to some of your local councillors, but yeah, I would start contacting them and speaking to them about how food and farming can fit into those investment plans. Next slide, please. If you want to jump onto the next one, that'd be grand. Yeah, so on the Levelling Up Fund, which is another fund that fits under the Levelling Up agenda, this is slightly different in the sense that it's just a 4-year fund. It's already had one round last year. The second round is open at the moment, and then there'll be 2 more rounds in the next 2 consecutive years. And it's worth, 4.8 billion over that period. So split between England and Scotland and Wales, as I've put on the slide there. I'm not sure what the split between Scotland and Wales is specifically. I couldn't find that in the information. So if somebody else knows, please put it in the chat. But this fund, it kind of came about, and the language that was being used was that it's part of the UK's response to COVID and its recovery from it. So again, it's just worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about proposals you might want to put forward to get money from this fund. And it's slightly different to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund in the sense that it's not split between every local authority, and not every local authority will get some money. It's more down to competitive bidding. So it's about getting your local MP to back one of your bids and really try and push it through, rather than everywhere will get some money to spend. Next slide, please. So these are the themes that sort of the 3 broad themes that fall under the Levelling Up Fund. I think it's sort of thinking about food and farming in this sense. I think urban regeneration and cultural assets are definitely 2 themes that it can deliver on. Local transport, obviously, not so much, although it would be quite interesting to see if somebody tries that one around maybe distribution. I don't know whether it's just public transport or whether it's more broad, but I think it is just public transport. Just some things to really bear in mind with this fund in particular is that you really need to get a member of parliament behind your bid. They are kind of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, while members of parliament are kind of involved and they have to be part of it a little bit, this fund, they very much are expected to be backing a bid. So yeah, I would say, you know, start kind of building some proposals and engaging with your local MP and start getting them to hopefully try and get behind it. The other thing is that the fund, there's probably opportunities to do bigger bids. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, it might be that they grant fund 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 pounds to a project, whereas this fund, as you can see on the slide there, there's opportunities for bigger sort of things. So 1 to 5 million. I mean, I don't know if Ren's got case studies that she'll go over later of ones that are bigger than that, but yeah, really big, much bigger bids can be sought after. Next slide, please, Ren. So just thinking about this, you know, obviously one of the reasons why you're here today is because you fall into a category 1 levelling up area, as they've termed them. So that means that your area is a priority for levelling up fund money. And it also means that your area, I'm assuming that, that means your local authority, they can also get money to help build funding bids and things like that as well. So that's really important. The application windows are really short, so it's really key to start thinking early. I mean, I don't know about you and Ren, Emily, but it might be a bit too short notice for putting bids in this year, but it's really key to start thinking about what bids you might want to put in next year or the year after in the last 2 rounds. And the Levelling Up Fund is really trying to, while we would love to be able to sort of be thinking, I suppose, strategically about using these funds to solve the local food system as a whole, this fund is really trying to get people to think about quite narrow things, so solving specific problems. So another thing to really bear in mind when you're trying to pull together a proposal, and also looking at opportunities to to unlock more money, so especially from the private sector as well, is another important thing to try and bring into your proposals. Next slide, please. So just to touch on the last couple of funds. So there's the Community Ownership Fund. It's a much smaller fund. I think, again, it's already had 1 round, or is it 2 rounds? Or it might be having its 2nd round this year, I think. So there'll be 2 more rounds. What's really interesting about this fund is that it's about trying to get local communities to purchase assets, so buildings and land, basically, and use that to the community's advantage, I suppose. So that could be the examples that are cited in the prospectus for this fund is things like, the local pub, village shop, the sports centre that might be at risk of closing down, and the community can then purchase that with match funding to keep that in the community's control. And obviously that could include, for example, a community buying a block of land to do community food growing, or it could be a community, using money to get a lease on a building to turn into a food hub, for example. So yeah, it's a much smaller fund, but it's really worth considering going for. The National Skills Fund, which I mentioned earlier, that's England only, but it's about adult skills, and there's a lot in there. It specifically mentions agriculture, horticulture, business management, warehouse and distribution. So again, opportunities for building skills in the local community and hopefully improving job prospects as well. Next slide, please. I've already kind of touched on these things. So yeah, the Community Ownership Fund, it's got to be match funded. And there's also that £50,000 to develop the project as well, which is really helpful, I think. So yeah, the 3rd round opens in May, so this month. And yeah, I've already kind of touched on the national skills stuff as well. But again, it's just important to, I think, know that it's about people who are already employed as well as self-employed or unemployed or trying to return to work from a break. So it's not just sort of exclusionary for a certain group of people, which I think is good as well. Yeah, and I think that's everything for me. Oh no, a couple more slides, sorry. So yeah, on to the next one, please, Ran. So just try to put this into a really simple visual. I'm not sure how useful it is to do it so simply, but I think these are 3 kind of key things for me. So I think as food partnerships, trying to identify projects that you would like to see levelling up money going into, and really trying to link those to the themes or the priorities of the funds. I've put the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and Levelling Up, so the different funds. Try and bring a group of stakeholders around those proposals. So, there might be some farmers in your area that are really keen to see some money going into, levelling up the food and farming system in their area. Other, public health officials might back things, for example. I think it's just good to get a real strong group of stakeholders around proposals, and it's going to give them more of a chance of going through. And really critical, I know I've said it a couple of times, but yeah, sort of start engaging with your local authorities on these investment plans and try and get food and farming in there. I mean, again, it's not really clear in the guidance that they've given whether these investment plans are sort of set in stone once they're created, or whether they can be adapted, or whether they're going to be reviewed in the future. I mean, I don't know if Emily or Ren or anyone else has seen any more information on that, but I imagine they're not just sort of set in stone, and then they never kind of can be adapted. But I think if we could, if you can get food and farming into them now, all the better. And then next slide, it's just the last one from me. So we'll be using this Venn diagram actually in the breakout rooms to help kind of with conversation. But yeah, these are the 3 things to consider with proposals, as about what are your priorities, your local authorities' priorities, and then what is the Levelling Up Funds themes and their priorities, and try and find that sweet spot in the middle. Yeah, so I'll hand over back to Ren.
Thanks, James, for that whistle stop tour. If you've got any questions about those different funds, just put them in the chat and we can come back. But I thought it might also be useful to just run through a few examples of where areas have received funding already to specifically support food projects, and that link really well into kind of food partnerships and the kind of the 6 key themes of sustainable food places. So I'm just going to run through them, give a bit of an overview, and I will follow up with kind of more information. A lot of them have their bids online too, so as well, if you're thinking about putting a project together, don't reinvent the wheel, just use existing kind of bids that have been put together. But I'm going to start with New Haven in East Sussex. They received round 1 for the Levelling Up Fund for a really interesting project, which they called Capturing the Value of the Catch. And the whole idea of this project is to boost the fishing industry. At the moment, the fish that's fished around New Haven doesn't stay in New Haven. It's processed and sold elsewhere. So the idea of this Levelling Up Fund was to bring the fishing industry back into New Haven. So they got £12.7 million, and a lot of this money was for building kind of the infrastructure in that local area. So they'd done a lot of, before the funding came out, they'd already been doing a lot of work in the community to understand the needs of the local area. They've been speaking to fishers to understand kind of what they'd like to see. With this money, they've managed to, in their proposal, is 2 new fishing landing stages, 16 small boats for the fishers to use, and then a processing centre, which also will have an auction house and a marketplace for the fish to come in, as well as a new restaurant on the promenade and space for new enterprises to kind of bring tourism to that area of New Haven. I mean, Emily, you might want to come in because it's sort of your area, but they where you live, but it was the project itself was I believe quite successful because it was this kind of, it told this story of New Haven as a place, and it really aligned with the government, the Levelling Up agenda, sort of pride and place and jobs and skills and things. They're also working with the local college to see if they can run a program on getting people into different sectors of the fishing industry. But when I spoke to the local council officer involved in putting the bid together, he was really one of his main takeaways was keeping the local councillors and MP involved in the bid from the kind of start to finish. So coming up with the idea, putting it past councillors and local MP, keeping updated almost every 2 weeks. But also a big part of the funding was building in capacity funding. So they've been able to bring in other council departments. They've got the regeneration team, the parks team, I think, all working on different parts of this project so that it's kind of owned by the council and kind of the local community. Emily, do you want to pop in?
Oh, well, only when you finished. I just have something to add.
You can jump in now.
Oh, okay. It was just to say, I think there was another interesting lesson from that, which is that I know there were different types of bid looked at. And one of the reasons that this one went through to the final stage, sorry if it's a bit noisy here, one of the reasons it went through to the final stage was because there was a sufficient output of jobs. It was quite a concentrated area, so it's a more urban end. I know there was also a look at some more rural projects, but because of the way that it's assessed, you then do have to be able to show a kind of density of jobs to meet the government's, they call it the Green Book, the way that they assess it. So I think that's quite interesting as well, just to be aware that it's much harder to get kind of rural projects onto the starting blocks for that particular fund.
Yeah, definitely. But what I would add to that too is I think the jobs they've put in are about 70, so it's not masses either. It's not like they're looking for kind of hundreds of new jobs. But yes, that is one sort of indicator that they are putting into the Levelling Up Fund, especially. I think less so with the Shared Prosperity Fund. So another area that received Levelling Up funding was Newham in London for their 15-minute neighbourhood idea. They received £20 million of Levelling Up funds. With the project was to ensure that every resident of Newham was able to access their basic needs through walking or cycling 15 minutes within the borough. So obviously this isn't just a food related project, but food links in really closely with this. They are rebuilding 2 of their main food markets in the borough, and they are also doing a bit of a mapping exercise of disused council buildings, and will be offering them up for peppercorn rent for kind of new enterprises, of which they're hoping many will be food and community food projects. They really, with this bid, it's also online, so I'll share it with you. They focus in a lot on their council priorities. So they did a lot of community mapping beforehand. This is actually before the Levelling Up bid came out. They'd already been doing it to understand kind of the community needs post-COVID, where they had been doing a lot of kind of surveying and leafleting and things in the borough to understand what the community wanted. And this was an idea that came out through kind of co-designing. And they even ran a citizens' assembly to vote on different ideas for this fund. But the main priorities that they focused on within their council was the community wealth building agenda, which is massive in Newham at the moment. They're doing lots of really interesting stuff, but also COVID recovery, health and wellbeing, social integration, and challenging inequality. And in their bid, they didn't just focus on kind of the key levelling up government agendas, but they also talked a lot about building back better, healthy and active communities, path to net zero. So it's just worth kind of understanding that sort of the government language of the day and just dropping in those buzzwords. So the next I'm going to talk about our Community Renewal Fund, which was the kind of precursor to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which was kind of about piloting projects which could be replicated for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And these two are quite interesting. I feel like they're very relevant to food partnerships specifically. So in Torfaen, they managed to secure just over £600,000 for their Food for Growth project, which aimed at understanding how they could support producers, processors and food poverty services to develop a whole systems approach. This came from a bit of work that the council had already been doing. So during COVID, they have had some underspend for their tourism budget for obvious reasons. They redirected that to supporting emergency food provision and community groups doing work on food projects, and realized that there was some really interesting work going on there, and wanted to understand how they could support those groups to kind of transition to more resilient kind of services essentially. And they also looked at kind of local businesses, especially rural businesses, and how they could support them to diversify, which they were already doing during the pandemic. So how can they kind of help them diversify and maintain their kind of business ideas. So they split their bid into 3 different kind of avenues. So one, they did some really interesting feasibility studies. So they've done a really cool piece of research on mapping. They've mapped the land in Torfaen, understanding what's been used, what's it been used for. Could there be land that can be used for community food growing and things like orchards and things. They have been doing some studies on or working with farmers and growers to understand their needs and how they can diversify their supply chains. And they've also been looking at this idea of using these hubs which were created through these emergency food provision services, how they can make those into kind of these what they're calling well-being hubs, so a bit more of a wraparound service, things like bringing in counsellors, housing support, that kind of thing. So they offered out grants to both community groups and small food rural businesses to do various different things. So and some examples of the food businesses is one farmer brought a milk vending machine, another one brought their kind of meat packing on site. another grower has started their own kind of pick your own service. And the emergency food provision, things like buying chillers, but also bringing in people like councils as part of these kind of wellbeing hubs. They are using this work, all these different projects that they've been supporting, to do a bit of an evaluation, which they're going to feed into their UK Shared Prosperity Fund bid, and hoping to do some kind of, get some funding on some kind of food resilience, local food system work. So that's, I feel like that's very relevant to what's happening with food partnerships. It was council led, but they work really closely with the community already. So that had already existed in the area, which is true for where you guys are. And then the final one, if you guys were at the webinar that Emily and I did a few weeks ago, we did have the Falkirk food features on, but I thought it was worth just mentioning again, because Falkirk Fourth Environment Link were the environmental charity that led this funding, and they worked with the council, and they are the organisation behind the development of their food partnership, and they're actually using some of this money to help formalise their food partnership and their membership to Sustainable Food Places. They're actually using this bid as part of their food partnership development. And quite similar to Torfine, they're looking at how to kind of improve dignified access to nutritious, sustainable, acceptable and affordable foods. Similar system and kind of mechanism, using small grants for hyperlocal food projects. And there's some really interesting stuff that they've been working on. Some where kind of food pantries have been able to get some piece of land to start food growing to feed into their pantries. One group, I wrote it down, really interesting. They're using local algae for biochar to use as plant fertilizer. This is an existing community food growing site, and they've actually managed to double their production by doing that. And then another one was a community meal service run by a Muslim women's group, that they wanted to tackle the issue of culturally appropriate food, but also share their food practices more widely. So some really kind of interesting projects within those small grants. And then on top of that, they were Fourth Environment Link were running workshops on things like carbon literacy, digital inclusion. They've got a youth ambassadors program. So some kind of quite interesting work, and their whole kind of ethos was they're not like reinventing the wheel. They're not doing anything, you know, novel, but they are building on existing work that's happening in the local area. The bid came about because they had already been asked by the NHS to build a food systems needs assessment, kind of as we were coming out of the main part of the pandemic, to understand where the food needs were. So they'd already kind of built up some recommendations. So as food partnerships, that information probably already is there, but it's probably useful to start thinking about kind of recommendations for a more resilient local food system where you are. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go over this just really quickly, but this isn't something that was funded, but this is something that James has been working on a lot, and Sustain has, but this idea of food hubs. It is a word that Tory MPs seem to like, so take from that what you will. Food hub, again, doesn't have one definition, but we're seeing it as this bit of a distribution hub for food growers and farmers, as a way to for a kind of alternative shorter supply chain. This can be done in many different ways, but there is one in Food Hub that was set up in London in 2019, where 3 veg box schemes got together. They lost their main wholesaler and they got together and realised that they could set up their own thing. So they managed to get some warehouse space in Barking and Dagenham, and are now working with 15 farmers and supporting 10 veg box schemes and 2 shops. So it's been a really interesting transition to supporting farmers in a different way. I can send you information about kind of costings and things, but it's a bit of a package project if that is something that is rumbling in your area. But I would say there has to be clear demand first. There's absolutely no point in thinking about setting a food hub if there's no one to use it. But that's just something that we've been kind of rumbling in the background in Sustain and Sustainable Food Places. And there's been some really interesting research on it already. You know, Martin Garnett's done some interesting stuff, but I'll send you useful links after this. I'm going to quickly run over some engaging with MPs kind of tips. My colleague Ollie was supposed to come and do this, but because of the U-turn on the buy one get one free stuff, he's been pulled into some action we're doing at Sustain. But he did send me some slides and a bit of information. This might be kind of common knowledge, but I feel like it's always useful to run over useful tips and tricks for engaging with MPs. So if you don't already know who your MP is, it's worth kind of doing a bit of research, understanding kind of what their interests are. There's some good websites. Hansard Parliament has all the debates that happen in Parliament, so you can go in there and you can see what your MP was involved in and what they said. They Work for You and Parallel Parliament are also really good in understanding what APPGs and select committees your MP is part of, what kind of questions they've asked recently, what they vote on. It's kind of good to get a bit of a picture on where you can get a hook in to engage with your MP. But things to consider are kind of your MP's role. If your MP is a minister, they might have their hands tied a little bit in terms of how much that they can engage and how much they can bring up what you would like them to talk about, because they'll be tied to certain things. But if they're a shadow minister, they might be really happy to counteract the government of times line, so that might be actually quite a good in. But again, they might have their hands tied for things like backbench debates and things. Quickly, select committees and APPGs. Select committees are a really good way to try and get a bit of influence. There are specific issues. There'll be things like education. There's food, environment, food and rural affairs. Yeah, and so if your MP sits on one of these select committees, it might be that you can try and ask them to bring something up in the next meeting. They meet every 2 weeks. They do things like inquiries and reports, and it's kind of a good in if you can link what you're doing with a select committee. APPGs are kind of the next level of tier of influence, so less influential than select committees, but there are APPGs on absolutely everything. And in the food world, there's APPGs on food banks, agroecology. I think there's one on fruit and veg. So if your MP is on one of these APPGs, it's great. It's a great way to kind of ask questions or get them to talk about what you're up to. In terms of getting an MP on your side, MPs get loads of emails. So if you're going to email your MP, make sure they know that you're a constituent, so that you've got your address and you've got something specific to bring up about the local context. You can ask your MP to do certain things. You can ask them to write a private letter to a minister. This is particularly relevant for levelling up. You might want to ask them to if you think that the levelling up agenda in your area is not reaching the right communities, perhaps that's a way in. You can ask them to write a written or oral question, and you can, or just generally more information on levelling up. If you are able to get a meeting with the MP, that's the gold star, and that's a great way to get in. And this is where you want to share a story. So MPs love it when they have stories from local constituents that they can bring into debates and kind of bring their debates kind of to life. So if you do manage to get a story and a meeting with the MP, share a story, especially if it's a bad one. They like bad stories because it kind of gives a bit of ammunition to their argument. But yeah, once you've got that, it's a great way in and to keep them in touch. And just generally things like, if you follow them on Twitter, keep them tagged, keep them updated on what you're up to. But that's a bit of an overview. If you have any questions about engaging with MP, I can try Emily, or I can try and answer them, but I can also put you in touch with Ollie, who works on all of that stuff at Sustain. Just quickly, are there any questions? I want to jump in. Hands up. Emily or James, do you want to jump in and then before we go into breakout rooms?
No, I think you did a pretty good summary there, to be honest. I don't know if you want to stop sharing just to make sure if anyone's got their hand up physically, to see if anybody had any questions.
You're looking pretty silent here, I haven't scared you off. So we're going to move into some breakout rooms. I've put us into 2 rooms. And it's just an opportunity to have a bit more discussion on what you're up to in your food partnership and how you can link it into the levelling up agenda and your local council priorities. So we'll have about half an hour. Someone's phone is going off. So I'm going to move us into breakout rooms now, and we'll have a little bit of a chat. So let me just do that now.
Right, and just before we disappear, do we need to move the Miro boards? Will be working from around a bit as well. Do you want to help us do that, or I can help with that? Oh, can't hear you, Em. Don't worry, we'll work it out. It's just if it was just asking about the Miro boards, but that's fine. We'll just go in our rooms and sort it out when we're there.
Sorry about that. And my
I can hear you now.
not working today very well. Okay, join the breakout rooms, and if you guys could share the Miros and go through, that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, we're the only ones here.
It's a little weird. I'm embarrassingly this whole time doing online meetings. The first time I've used Zoom breakout. I've been the person to do all the Zoom breakout rooms. So it's all quite new to me. But I thought I'd put it on a 30-minute timer, but I don't know what happened. There's the other group coming back.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Maybe a few more. Welcome back. I hope that was useful to have a bit more of a discussion about what's going on in your local area. I don't know about James or Emily, but we didn't necessarily follow the Miro board, but we did have a good chat about kind of what's going on locally. Emily or James or anyone from the other group, do you want to give a bit of a few reflections on what you talked about?
I don't mind doing that unless someone else wants to. Do you want, maybe if I do it and then you'll chip in. So we had a few questions that would be really useful that we were tasked with to go away and find out. So I'll say them now so that you've got them, Ren, because I suspect you might be looking them up. One was about the capital elements, because we were aware that the capital spend in the Shared Prosperity Fund is quite small, and there was some interest in a community food growing project. And so what are the options around buying land, which isn't to say you can't do community food growing without buying the land, because there's other access to land, but that would be useful just to clarify. Useful to clarify if there's any quirks around the devolved nations, because obviously we had Wales and Scotland in the room and there's slightly different rules. So if there's a crib sheet on that would be really helpful. And also on the time frame for spending, because we know all these different funds are quite tight, that we're looking for shovel ready projects, but we weren't actually quite clear on what the timescales were, which is going to be quite important. I think the reflections that we had were people at really different stages. So, it's mixed people sort of really just were trying to get their head around what a project might look like, and people who were thinking and already connection, obviously they're all council-led bids, so if that's not happening already, but there was a bit of a mix about engagement with the councils, but actually finding the person who's going to write that bid's really important, because if they've already got something else in your head, it's a bit of a hiding to nothing, isn't it? You don't want to spend too long on it. On the other hand, you might just be the answer to your council officer's prayers at the moment, who's been tasked with coming up with something that meets the priorities. And I think the other reflection was quite a mix of things, but there was really strong interest across all of them in around the kind of the cost of living agenda as the backdrop which this is taking place, and the importance about community resilience and food resilience, and two of the groups were quite interested in strengthening their emergency food network type approach. It wasn't necessarily put in those terms, but the kind of the stuff that's going on the ground around emergency food and how that could be strengthened in terms of a movement. There was one other good tip, which was actually, when you hear about what isn't going to work, we heard that actually the approach we saw earlier, I'm going to say this wrong, but Torfaen, is it Torfaen? They're the next door neighbours to Blaenau Gwent, but actually, and there was this idea that we could expand this model outwards, but actually Blaenau Gwent's not that interested because they want to do their own thing, which is just really so typical, isn't it? Because actually, these council-led bids often, and it's got the MP involved as well, double layer of politics. Often they want their own thing. I think those were my main thoughts. I don't know if you had anything to add, James, or anyone else who was in the room.
Nothing from me. I think that's a really good overview.
Anyone else? Did I miss your pearls of wisdom?
Thank you, Emily. That's really interesting, and similar things coming through from our group. There was a lot of chat about work happening already to transition these sort of emergency food hubs that have arose from COVID, and how to kind of transition them into more resilient hubs and projects, how we can create more good food jobs rather than like this kind of volunteering and which tends to be kind of the same demographic of people. Interestingly, we had Sam from Cardiff in the room, and they actually had I don't know if you want to chip in, Sam, but they were unsuccessful with their first round of Levelling Up funding, which was for a regeneration of a market. Was it a food market or just a general?
Yeah, Cardiff Market. Yeah, it's a grade 2 listed building that just needed regeneration. So it had that food element because it has food stalls in there.
Thank you. And it was unsuccessful because of economic regeneration.
Yeah, I was told that the economic impact area was the area that they didn't score very well on. The team didn't really have much help around the HMT Green Book, and if they were to do it again, which unfortunately they're not allowed to bid again for it, they would find some help around that as well, and needed to be stronger on linking it back into the UK government data, is what I've been told.
So yeah, just to kind of something to think about. Some points that you might want to think about considering if you're working with the council to put a proposal in. Thanks for that, Sam. It's such a shame that was not successful. But we ended up talking a lot about actually food growing and how this could, what would this mean in terms of accessing government funding, and also are the local authorities generally the best place. There was kind of lots of chat about I don't want to phrase it wrong, but there was some frustration about kind of council objectives and not thinking outside the box, which I think is a prime opportunity for food partnerships to be outside that box and put those proposals together. Anyway, we only have 3 minutes left. I'm aware everyone always has meetings to jump onto, so I don't want to go over. I just want to see if anyone had any last reflections, or it would also be very useful. This is the first time we've run this kind of session, whether it was useful and whether anything else would have been kind of a better format, or more or less information would be very useful. If you want to dump anything in the chat, that would be very useful. I will follow up with the slides and kind of relevant links and reading materials and things, so you've got all of that. But it would be really, really great for us for you to keep us updated if you do have any input in any funding bids or proposals or anything related to this kind of Levelling Up agenda. Do keep us in the loop, because it's really useful for us to also share with the wider network, the Sustainable Food Places network.
I just wondered, Ren, if it's worth just flagging, because it seems to be it's interesting how many people have mentioned something about emergency food networks and moving to a more of a hub model, moving to a slightly different model around that. And just to flag, I suppose it might be worth people keeping in touch with each other, because certainly for the Shared Prosperity Fund, there's no competition involved. So it would be worth just trying to collaborate, about if that's going to be the focus of several bids, it would be good to try and put those people together perhaps, or at least for you informally to hook up over that. Obviously they'll all be different anyway, because everyone's place is different, but there's got to be some ways we could share learning on that.
Great, thank you, Emily. I've just captured that. So if anyone else hasn't got any, if anyone got any last reflections, do chime in. If not, it was very informative to hear what's going on locally, and it feels positive that hopefully kind of food will be more embedded. And yes, it was great to see you, and I hope you enjoy the sunshine.
Bye everyone, great to see you all. Thanks, Ren.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.